Welcome to the a16z podcast. I'm Michael Copeland, and I'm here with Benedict Evans, who's actually just joined Andreessen Horowitz recently. Moved all the way from London. He's a longtime mobile analyst and an all-around smart fellow. Benedict, welcome.
Hello. Great to be here at a16z.
Z, as they say.
Makes for a good band name. ZZ Top.
Well, you have to start the band. So let's talk about mobile, which you like to talk about and think about. There's been a lot of sort of Windows OS, Windows Mobile sort of news out recently out of Mobile World Congress. But is the war for the mobile OS already over?
Well, short answer, yes. But it's not quite clear what that means, in as much as Apple has about, in a launch quarter, they have about 10% of all the phones sold on Earth. And Android has another 45 to 50%, although only about two-thirds of those are Google Android and one-third are in China and don't have any Google services. And the remaining half or thereabouts of the phone market will convert over the next 3 or 4 years to phones running smart OSs, or there'll be a kind of a residue of 5 or 10% of people who really can't afford them.
Right.
And actually the interesting question is how many people have an affordable data plan rather than how many people have a phone running Unix or some other operating system. And all the remaining growth is going to be at super low prices. You know, it's going to be at $50 or $75 or $25. And there's a little bit of skirmishing around the edges, yes. So you've got Firefox playing one rather eccentric business model over on one side, and you have Microsoft's Windows Phone, which is now being combined with Nokia, selling in fairly small numbers in a certain number of middle-income and emerging markets, exclusively at very low prices. So if you look at Nokia's ASP, it's very clear they're only selling the low-end phones. They're only selling the 520 or the 530 and the 610.
Right.
And they also could give geographic sales, and I think they only sold 500,000 or 600,000 units in the USA last quarter. So for all the advertising and the buzz around the big phablets with the great cameras, nobody at all is buying those devices. All the Windows Phone sales so far have been to people, arguably, who don't even really treat them as smartphones. So, that may change, and, there's some interesting things around what Microsoft might do with that, what Nokia is trying to do with Android. But the core, I think, is that you have iOS and you have Android, and then you have people building stuff on top of Android to greater or lesser extents, whether that's the Chinese who are using stock Android but not using Google because there's no Google in China, or whether it's Amazon who built a tablet and are probably building a phone on their own custom forked version of Android, and now Nokia have got a forked version of Android as well. But that's almost like, I don't know, it's like looking at the Second World War and arguing about who's going to beat the Italians, it doesn't really matter.
Right.
For all practical purposes, we have two substantial ecosystems, and as things play out with the current dynamics, which aren't really going to change in the next 2 or 3 years, we will end up with 700, 800, 900 million iOS devices in use on Earth. It's probably about 500 now. And we'll end up with 2, maybe 3 billion Android devices in use on Earth.
Billion. So a factor of,
Yeah. Because
5 or 6 times.
Well, there's probably 3.5 to 4 billion mobile phone users on Earth. There's quite a lot more SIM cards, but lots of people have multiple SIMs, especially when you go to markets like India or Africa for coverage and for also to get on network pricing deals and so on. So you've got 3.5 to 4 billion people on Earth who've got a phone. You probably only really, as a developer or a technology company, it's probably the top 2 billion to 2.5 billion are the people who are really spending money, and the other half, you're looking at people who are spending $5 a month, $2 a month, $1 a month, and buying a $20, $30 phone, which is where the half of the market is now. And so the question is, well, what happens on top of that platform?
Right. I mean, have we seen this play out before in the PC landscape, for example? And are there analogies that we can point to see where we're headed next?
Well, this is the question. Apple will top out, so there's a very obvious argument that says that the biggest ecosystem has a gravitational pull that sucks in the developers and sucks in the usage, and that becomes self-fulfilling, that it's got the best apps, so that's where the consumers who want the best apps go, and so that's where the developers go, and it's a sort of virtuous circle. And that's certainly what happened with Microsoft 20, 30 years ago. The problem is that, as a professor at my old college at Cambridge said, the only thing that history teaches you is that something will happen. And, the dynamics of the PC industry was so different that it's really quite unhelpful to draw that comparison. For example, at the critical period of the PC industry, most of the sales were corporate.
Right.
And corporate buyers wanted 1,500 generic boxes that they would put under people's desks. So they didn't care what they looked like, they didn't care how easy the user interface was, because they were never going to be reconfigured and they were going to run one app. And they wanted a quote from 5 vendors and they picked the lowest quote. And so Apple didn't have product market fit. And Microsoft Wintel did.
Right.
That's clearly not how phones get bought.
Mm-hmm.
Phones get bought by individuals on fit and feel and the user experience and design. And they're not, by and large, sold on specs. At least they're not sold on... They're sort of sold on some of the experiences that some of the specs can provide, but they're not sold on RAM. And so Apple now does have product market fit. It's selling exactly into the kind of buying environment that suits what they've been doing for 30 years. But I think there's a sort of broader point, and the sort of the specific ecosystem point. As I said, presume for the sake of argument that there are winner-takes-all dynamics around smartphone mobile operating systems, as there were with PCs, that's where everything is, so that's where everything is. Well, Apple's going to have 800 million users before there's time for those effects to kick in.
Right.
Now imagine you are Marks and Spencer's, or Target, or Bank of America, or Carrefour, or Aldi, or
Walmart. You've mentioned Carrefour, but you're in the United States now, so we're
any retailer,
right?
And it is actually, and there's a specific point here, it is actually a country by country issue.
Right.
If you are Carrefour in France, right now you have an Android app and an iOS app. Do you have a Windows Phone app? Probably not, because there's no Windows Phone users in your country, and the people who do have Windows Phone are, it's too small to be worth bothering with. But you're not going to pull the iOS app, the iPhone app, because that's only a third of the subscriber base.
Right.
You're not even going to pull it if it was to drop to a quarter or even 10% of your subscriber base. And actually, if you were to look at share of value right now, it's probably 3/4 of your basket size.
And
so the market share number... it doesn't work in quite the same way. If you were a software developer 30 years ago and you were saying, right, we're going to invest $10 million making an application for Windows, do we invest another 5 making it for Mac? And there's no offices, none of our target customers have bought a Mac.
Right.
The answer was no, and that became completely self-fulfilling. But if you are, as I said, a supermarket or a bank or a movie chain, movie cinema theatre chain, or any other modern service that feels like it needs to be engaged with its customers online, you don't do that kind of calculation. You think, okay, where are our customers? Where is a significant number of our customers? What are the touch points? Where do we need to be? And Windows Phone and BlackBerry are locked off the bottom end of that.
Right.
But, there's a vicious circle here and also a virtuous circle. It's extremely hard to kill an ecosystem as long as the product's good and the customers keep buying it. The way that BlackBerry killed its ecosystem, in effect, was by having a product that was no longer competitive. But I don't think anyone would look at an iPhone and say, well, it's not a competitive product. It would cease to be a competitive product if there were no apps for it.
Right.
But how do you get there?
You mentioned value, and it has been the case for a long time that iOS has sort of the value has accrued to iOS far more than to Android, that ecosystem. Do you see any shift in that, just by sheer footprint and or by Google in some sense catching up, or those people who are using Android catching up?
I think it depends. So there's a couple of ways to look at this. The first is that consumer behavior is often shaped by self-selection. That is to say, what is the kind of person who goes out and buys a $600 phone? What is the kind of person that goes out and buys a $100 phone?
Right.
And that's different in different markets. So in the US, you can get a Galaxy S3 for free. I would imagine. I have to look at the pricing. You can get a good mid-range smartphone for free. So why would you buy a $100 smartphone? The only people who are buying $100 smartphones are people who actually genuinely don't care.
Right.
Whereas in Indonesia, someone who's bought a $100 smartphone saved up for that and they care a lot. But then you look at a Western European market, there's a pretty clear correlation between people who buy high-end phones and the amount that they're interested in and engaged with all the things that you could do with them. And the people who buy low-end phones don't. And when you then look at the market share of high-end phones, it's half, two-thirds, three-quarters iPhone, and the rest goes to high-end Android phones. And then, the problem with looking at those, the value sizes is that effectively Apple's only got the good customers.
Right. Right.
Android has all the customers. So it's got some good customers. It's also got some moderately good customers. It's also got grandma who went to the store and said, I need a new phone.
Right.
And they gave her a $100 Android phone. And so within that, so you've got a much lower average for Android. Concealed within that, you've got a big chunk of people who are worth having.
Right.
But then when you add that up, you still get to, an actual basket size or an e-commerce transaction or, a payment rate on Android that's half what you see from iOS. And that's, as I said, it's really just a function of price. The corollary of that, of course, is that if Apple was to make a $150 phone,
and do you think
their average would collapse because they'd be getting loads of people who don't care.
And so that's why they're not going to do that. I mean, the iPhone 5C is far down market as they go.
No, I don't think that's true. I mean, you have to think about, as I could have make the maths a different way, you have to think about the average and the absolute. That's to say there's 1 billion Android users off the top of my head. Maybe 100 million of them have got $500 and $600 phones.
Right.
And those guys are worth having.
Right.
But if you apply that to the average is crappy.
Right.
Whereas Apple has only got the $600 phone, so their average looks really good, and they've probably got 2 or 3 times more high-value customers than are on Android. Or maybe they've got the same number, depends how you analyze it. So you have to be careful sort of thinking about the mass of the average versus the absolute. Looking at the 5C, kind of analogies get horribly overused, but it is kind of useful to think about Apple as BMW. In a bunch of different ways. First of all, BMW does not sell as many cars as Toyota sells mopeds. They probably don't consider that to be a major existential problem.
Right.
And, there's a lot of mopeds in Android land, and there's a lot of Lexuses in Android land.
Right.
And BMW care about Lexus, but they don't care about the mopeds. And so to their product portfolio, it's like, think about the 5 Series, it was like Apple only made a BMW 7 Series.
Yep.
And now they make the 5 Series. But BMW makes an S3 Series, and they also make an they make some smaller cars as well.
A 1 Series.
They don't make mopeds,
right?
But they do they have gone down that progression and maintain the quality level. And I think today it would absolutely be possible for Apple to make a $300 phone that would, to use Johnny Ive's line, would be a phone that they could be proud of. In much the same way that if you go out and buy a VW Golf, it's not an Aston Martin. But that doesn't mean there's anything wrong with it.
Right. So let's talk about if the sort of OS war is over, the mobile OS war is over, does the war shift?
Yeah, it's all about what happens on top.
And so what does that mean, and who else gets to play in that landscape?
Well, there's a big war and a small war. There's a small war, which is people trying to build platforms on top of Android, which is Amazon and Nokia and perhaps Microsoft in the future. And in that case, it's a lot easier to see what problem they're solving for themselves than what problem they're solving for the consumer, frankly. But the more interesting thing is when you look at what it means to say a smartphone or to say the mobile internet. If you think about how the desktop internet worked, we probably all had this conversation where you explained to somebody that the internet and the web are not the same thing. But for all practical purposes, they were.
Right.
There were a few things like Spotify and Skype around the edges, but basically for 20 years, the internet and the web were the same thing. And that's not the case on mobile. On the desktop, you had this box on the screen, and everything happened in that box. And there was a little bit of fighting 15 years ago about who got to make that box. And the Andreessen and Andreessen Horowitz has some opinions about that.
No doubt.
But frankly, all the innovation was happening inside the box. And you go to mobile, and the browser is just one of a dozen different things that you could be doing, or 2 dozen different things that you could be doing on that device. And none of that's settled yet either. If I was to say that I installed an app on my Android smartphone in 5 years' time, I don't know what any of those words would mean. I don't know what installed would mean, because is that a web app? Is it something happening within a messaging system? Is it a card that's being loaded dynamically by the operating system as I hold my phone up to a menu outside a restaurant? Has that been installed? I don't know what app would mean for the same reason. I don't know what Android's going to mean in 5 years' time. I don't think anybody knows what Android is going to mean in 5 years' time, and how that interacts with Chrome, and how that interacts with Google Play services, and where the innovation and the levers of interaction will sit on that platform. And of course, there's also a wild card about what you mean by phone. We may be sitting here waving our hands in the air, or looking at watches, or looking at smart glasses. And the thing that's really missing in that space is more silly acronyms. Samsung gave us the phablet, but we really need to be talking about the smotch and the wablet as well to kind of go with it.
I hope not. I'm wearing a smotch. Anyway, just to poke a little bit on that theme, do you think that the control goes away from Google and Apple in that sense? That, if there's all these different players, if we don't know, who owns the relationship? Or are you seeing signs that the relationship is, sort of shifting? I mean, Apple certainly has a tight hold. But in the Android world, does Google get to have the relationship, or is it something else?
Well, it's an interesting question about what Google is trying, and there's a Facebook story in here as well, of course. But there's an interesting question as to what it is that Google and Apple are trying to do. And I think, in a sense, the problem that people have looking at these businesses is they're actually, in a sense, much simpler than people think. Apple makes $300, $400, $500 boxes with circuit boards inside with a great experience.
Right.
They're not going to buy an airline so they can replace the in-flight entertainment system with iPads.
Right.
They're not going to buy a TV company. They're not going to buy a mobile operator. They're not going to buy an air freight business. They make boxes with circuit boards in, and they try and make them the best boxes they possibly can.
Right.
And Google is a vast machine learning engine that spent 15 years stuffing itself with data, and web search is an expression of that. Just as buying books is an expression of Amazon as a logistics platform. Right. So Amazon isn't a books company. And web search is an expression of Google's machine learning platform. So is Gmail, so is Maps, so is Now, so is the advertising platform that pays for it all. But those are all applications that sit on top of, maybe not in a literal sense, but in a metaphorical sense. They're all things that sit on top of an underlying machine learning project. Right. And so Google is not in the hardware business.
Well, $12.5 billion later, and then selling Motorola again. But yeah,
well, it wasn't 12.5 because it was 9.5 with cash, and then they sold the cable business.
Okay.
But yeah, I mean that was basically an enormous patent infringement fine as much as anything else. I think but the issue is just as Apple is not a cloud company, although it would sort of like to be sometimes. But it's only a cloud company in as much as it needs to be a cloud company. And there's a question for coming back to our point about ecosystems, the poison pill for Apple is not only having 800 million active devices. Is Google doing something in the cloud that Apple can't do that means you have to buy a not Apple device?
Right.
But it's hard to see how Apple, to my point about what Google's trying to do, Google is not in a one-to-one fight to the death with Apple. You could argue it's in a one-to-one fight to the death with Facebook. Mm-hmm. Or even potentially with Amazon. But Apple is a channel. For Google, the objective is reach. Reach for that people can use its search, you can see its advertising, also reach that it gets information back into that learning engine. And of course that's what Google Plus is about. Google Plus is not a search engine, social network, for heaven's sake. It's about indexing the users. It's PageRank for the users.
Right.
And so for Google, that means the sort of as I said, the platform war ended and Google and Apple both won because Google and Apple both got what they wanted, but they wanted different things. And everybody that goes out and buys an iPhone is using Google Search and Google Maps as long as Google Search and Google Maps are good.
Right.
And Google's problem is making sure that Maps and Search are good. And for Apple, if you're using Google Maps or Google Search on an iPhone, that's not a problem as long as you're buying an iPhone. And you'll buy an iPhone as long as the iPhone is good. And that's Apple's problem.
So let's shift gears a little bit. And you mentioned Facebook, but if you are an entrepreneur and somebody who wants to insinuate yourself into this ecosystem, how do you do it these days? And going forward, how do you, I guess, preserve your own leverage in the face of this massive footprint by Google and Android and Apple and iOS?
Well, I think there's two ways to think about this. One is that a smartphone is a richer and more complex and more sophisticated platform than the web. And it's also a vastly bigger platform than the web. I mean, we kind of threw around some big numbers earlier, but there will be, as it might be, 3 billion smartphones on Earth, with a massive range of income and capability and so on, and income of the users.
As massive as there are people, right?
Yeah, exactly. It will effectively be half the population of Earth will have a smartphone. And that compares with something like 1.5 billion PCs. And those PCs are either shared at home or locked down at work and don't go anywhere. They're not really portable. And so you have twice the number of devices, those devices, as I said, and those then devices are in everyone's hand all the time, as opposed to being in a desk or in a study or shared with your brother or something. And so the size of the internet gets 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 times bigger, just as a consequence of the shift from PC to mobile. And it still baffles me. I get flamed for daring to compare smartphone sales to PC sales. So people think that smartphones are like, still think that smartphones are a toy. They're not.
Right.
It's like thinking a PC is a toy and real men need mainframes, for God's sake. Smartphones are the dominant computing platform and the dominant internet platform. And will completely supplant PCs in importance. And they have a much more rich and much more complex set of options and opportunities and ways of engaging with users and, of course, ways of gaining users. And you can see that in a very small way in the acquisition of WhatsApp, which was like a fantastic case study of everything that's going on online. And one of the things it illustrated is just how big you can get if you get really lucky with the right idea and execute really well. 10 years ago, put it another way, in the time of the first internet bubble, a prototypical startup, an archetypal startup, you would have 100 people and you'd have raised $10 million and you'd have 1 million users.
Right.
And now...
If you were off to the races, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And now you'll have raised $1 million and you'll have 10 people and you'll have 100 million users.
Right.
So the whole thing has been completely turned on its head, and mobile is a big part of that. So that's one sort of point about scale. I think the second point is that we're kind of in a pre-page rank phase for how people discover and engage stuff online. That's to say, an app store now looks a lot like Yahoo 20 years ago.
Sea of
it always sounds like I'm trying to do a comedy routine when I describe this. It's like there was a website that listed every website that there was, and you could scroll through them all. And it was news when there was a new website. It would you go to Yahoo, I swear to God, you'd go to Netscape's What's Hot page, and it would say, the Morningwood, Arkansas Elementary School has got a website. It was like that was on the front page of your browser when you loaded the browser.
Right. Well,
And, you see this. To me, my point is that's what an app store is now.
Right.
You can browse every app that there is, but there's 1 million apps.
So we haven't
moved to the point where we discover, okay, how do we know what's going on? Mm-hmm. And part of that is some sort of manual curation. Part of it is better search in the app stores. And it's, it's a generic problem for both Apple and Google. They've got 1 million apps in their store.
Right.
But I don't think that is an execution problem it's not a question of improving the execution of what they're doing now. I mean, to me, a startup that says, we made an app and it's in the app store and it can't be discovered is like a writer who says, I wrote this book and it's in Amazon and no one can discover it there. It's like, well, they've got 25 million SKUs.
Right.
They can't put your book on the homepage necessarily.
Right.
So it's up to you. And yet, when you say it's up to you, well, but there's no SEO, there's no SEM equivalent. It doesn't follow that the answer is that Google will do better search or deep linking or any of these initiatives is the answer. But clearly we lack an answer. And we lack an answer also in a much, much more complex world because, as I said, it's not just about apps in the App Store. If I was to send you a restaurant review in a messaging app, it probably shouldn't arrive as a dumb URL string, as a piece of text. What should happen is that the restaurant review should appear on your phone screen, and you should be able to interact with it, and then you should be able to save it to your home screen. And then you say, whoa, what's just happened? Have I just installed a native app? Does it matter?
Right.
Does it mean anything to talk about HTML5 versus native code? Not really. What matters is, how does it get onto your phone? How do you interact with it? And all those questions, frankly, are still wide open. And to some extent, those are in the hands of Apple and Google as the platform owners who can make kind of elemental changes in what can be done on the platform. But they're also in the hands of Facebook. They're in the hands of WhatsApp. You see companies like Line and WeChat in particular being very aggressive in trying to turn their messaging systems into social platforms, application platforms, engagement and identity platforms on top of the smartphone OS and neutral to whether you're on iOS or Android. So there's a sort of swirling soup of interaction and engagement and user acquisition and identity and payment sitting on top of iOS and Android that Apple and Google have some control over, in that they can offer new options. But they don't really control the direction of it.
Right. So it sounds like what you're saying in some ways, and this relates to Yahoo, is that, this war is over. Going back to Yahoo won that war, but it turns out there was another war to be fought, and
it's like
won
it's like talking about browser wars. It's like, I don't think Mark Zuckerberg spends a lot of time thinking about Internet Explorer versus Chrome versus Safari versus Firefox.
Right.
It kind of, by the early 2000s, it just kind of became irrelevant. And yes, it might have gone another way, but it didn't. And I think, to a degree, you could suggest that smartphones sort of might go in that direction. Now, they might not if Apple or Google or both extend their depending on how they continue to extend their platforms in terms of what you can do on the device. But, and clearly Apple in particular is being very aggressive. There's another sort of an interesting contrast to draw here. So if you look at what Apple is doing in the way that they evolve their platform, because they own the whole stack, they're doing lots of stuff that's quite hard, that you can only do if you know what Bluetooth chip is in the phone.
Right.
So you see AirDrop, you see iBeacon, you see a lot of the local wireless discovery things. You see incidentally, you also things like using the M7 motion processor to reduce battery life, which again is really tough if you don't make the whole stack.
Right.
And in contrast, of course, you see Google lifting all their innovation up the stack into the cloud, into Google Play Services, into Now, into Maps, into Plus, and so on. And so Apple is moving down the stack and Google's moving up the stack, both of them, of course, into their comfort zone, into a place where it's hard for the other to follow them. So you do have this kind of interesting contrast as to what's going on in iOS and what's going on in Android. But beyond that, as a third party, you've got these two big platforms. There's a lot of common denominators between them. There's some interesting stuff on some that's not on the other, and vice versa. But by and large, as a generality, there's 1.4, 1.5 billion people on Earth who've got one of these things today.
Well, Benedict, I want to thank you for this discussion. It sounds like one war is over, and like you said, there's all sorts of things swirling around. And there's another war afoot as we speak. So we will be talking more about that. And I would love to sit down and have you untangle Amazon for us, for example.
Yes,
so Benedict, thanks very much. And we will be doing this on a regular basis.
Great.